Hi guys. So we had already talked about intuitors versus sensors. That was the previous video. If you missed that, or the first video that was about introverts versus extroverts, you might want to go back and watch those. And now we're going to talk about the thinkers versus the feelers. So just like the other types, those are 2 points on a continuum. So let's say your type came out, I'm just using example letters here, E, N, T, or F, P. All those letters are interchangeable. We're talking about this point, this letter as a part of your type. And as with all the other types, there's a continuum of whether or not you are more of a thinker or a feeler, and I'll explain what those terms mean in a second, with a midpoint on that continuum. So let's say you came out as an F. Your type here was F. But you were just maybe, slightly to the middle of the midpoint on F. That means you have tendencies like a feeler, but you're not so drastic to one side or the other. Whereas some people, can be a total thinker and they really approach the world, in that way. So not only does your letter matter, but kind of how far off of the midpoint you are, which is represented by a percentage that you probably got at the end of your test. So let's talk about specifics. So someone who's a thinker, really to sum it up, they base their decisions on logic. Whereas a feeler will base them on emotions. They use their head, thinker, versus a feeler really focusing on their heart. They like a thinker values objective decisions. They feel like if they made the decision objectively, then they can count on it. Whereas a feeler really wants their heart to be involved and for it to be a subjective decision. And they know they've taken all of the subjective factors into account and they feel comfortable with it. A thinker values justice more than they value mercy. So you'll find Dayanim are very often, and Poskim are very often thinkers, whereas counselors and people in helping professions are more often feelers. Thinkers are more apt to offer you critique, whereas feelers will offer you compliments. Thinkers will follow their principles, and they'll value their principles even in situations where it might hurt people's feelings, more than a feeler who values harmony and sees principles as something gray that can be flexed in order to accommodate interpersonal situations and human errors or human factors. A thinker values reason more than a feeler who values empathy. Thinkers could be described as firm but fair, and feelers can usually be described much more as compassionate. And a thinker will focus on the tasks and the best way to approach them, whereas the feeler is focused on relationships. So I want to give an example from marriage that relates to us. Let's say you and your spouse are planning a bar mitzvah for your child, and the size of the hall and the schedule of the caterer dictates that there's a deadline to give the caterer a number. This is normal. And you let all of your guests know there's a really firm deadline for RSVP. Great. A few days before the bar mitzvah, you've passed that deadline by far. You've given the caterer a count. The place settings are all done. The cards, everything's done. And then your Aunt Bertha, who is doesn't have these parties all the time, doesn't really understand how it works, calls you or your spouse and says, "Oh, my dear, I'm so excited to come to the simcha. I didn't RSVP, but I'm coming and I'm bringing 5 people. That's not a problem, right?" So you get off the phone and you speak with your spouse about it. You're a thinker and your spouse is a feeler. So you might approach the problem and say, "Look, I'm sorry that, her feelings might be hurt, but a deadline is a deadline. It will cause great inconvenience to the caterer, which is maybe a chilul Hashem. It'll stress us out, and that might cause other issues. It's not appropriate. We had a deadline. Like it or not, Aunt Bertha, I'm sorry you can't come. We'll find another way to include you in the simcha." Whereas your spouse, who's a feeler, would say, "We don't want to hurt her feelings, Aunt Bertha. She might not understand because she's not religious. Is it really such a big deal? Things are meant to be flexible. The caterer can just make a little extra food, no problem. Let's be flexible about it. Let's have compassion. Nothing's black and white. It's just a caterer in numbers. So that could cause huge fights in a marriage about planning, vacations, about how to discipline kids, about how to handle finances. So that's thinkers and feelers summed up, and kind of how the two views would clash in dealing with a potential problem.